Moving into a new apartment always comes with a mix of excitement and anxiety, especially for a college student trying to find their way. I had just arrived in the city, eager to start my life at university. The apartment seemed perfect, cheap, spacious, and just a short walk from campus. But there was something off about the place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The building itself was old, and the hallways had an almost forgotten feel to them, as if they hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. The worn-out carpet and creaky floors only added to the atmosphere of the building, but it didn't deter me. I needed a place to stay. I moved in without much thought. My roommate, Evan, was already there when I arrived. He was a quiet guy, the kind who didn't talk much but always seemed friendly enough. He greeted me with a warm smile, and we exchanged pleasantries. The first few days were uneventful. The usual settling-in routine, unpacking, getting used to the place, figuring out the best spots to study. But it didn't take long before things started to feel wrong. At first, it was small things. The whispers in the hallway late at night. Soft, almost inaudible, but constant. It sounded like someone talking, but when I checked, no one was there. I chalked it up to old pipes, to the creaky building settling in the night. But then, I started hearing strange noises in the apartment itself. At night, in my room, it was like someone was tapping on the walls. Light scratches, almost rhythmic. I tried to ignore it at first. Maybe I was just imagining things, but the noises grew more insistent, more distinct. And then there was Evan. At first, I thought I was just seeing things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was different. He was always in his room, the door closed, rarely coming out. But when I did see him, he looked off. He had this distant expression, like he wasn't really there. His eyes were always wide, his movements stiff. It was like he was sleepwalking through life. When I tried to ask him if everything was okay, he would just nod, but he never really answered. One night, I was woken by a noise coming from Evan's room. I thought I'd hear him get up, maybe go to the bathroom, but there was something different about the sound this time. It wasn't the usual creaks or knocks. It was a soft whispering coming from his room. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was like he was speaking to someone, but there was no one there. I decided to check it out. I opened Evan's door quietly, unsure of what I'd find. The room was dark, save for the glow of a small lamp on the nightstand. Evan was sitting in his chair, facing the wall. His eyes were wide open, but he wasn't moving. He wasn't even blinking. I called his name, but there was no response. It was like he didn't hear me. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I closed the door as quietly as I could, leaving him there. The next day, he was gone. I wasn't sure if he'd gone to class or just stepped out, but when I checked his room, it was empty. No sign of him. It was like he had just vanished. I tried texting him, calling him, but there was nothing. No response. Days passed, and Evan never returned. The apartment grew colder, emptier. I began to feel like I was being watched. I couldn't explain it, but something in the air felt wrong. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone in that apartment, even when no one else was there. After a few days of silence, I finally started to piece together what was happening. It wasn't just the apartment. There was something else there, something I couldn't explain. I could feel it, pressing in on me, surrounding me. And the whispers, they were louder now, more insistent. I could hear them even when I was awake, just beneath the surface of my thoughts. I decided to look into the history of the building. It didn't take long to find some unsettling details. The apartment complex had been built in the 1960s, but it had a dark history. Over the years, multiple tenants had complained about strange occurrences, noises, objects moving on their own, flickering lights. Some had even left in the middle of the night, never to be heard from again. One of the previous tenants had died under mysterious circumstances. According to the building manager, it was ruled an accident, but the stories lingered. The apartment had a reputation. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something was feeding on this place, feeding on the fear, the isolation. I wasn't just dealing with a haunted apartment. I was dealing with something much darker. The shadows in the hallways started to feel alive. They stretched and twisted as I walked past, always at the edge of my vision. And the whispers. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, speaking in strange, unintelligible languages, low and guttural, like they were coming from the walls themselves. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to find out what had happened to Evan, to stop whatever was happening in that apartment. So, I made my way to his room, determined to face whatever was lurking inside. The door to Evan's room was wide open. I had no idea how to explain it, but I could feel the air around me change, the tension, the heaviness. It was all there. I stood at the entrance for what felt like an eternity, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The whispers from earlier had stopped, but the scratching sound persisted. It was faint but constant, coming from somewhere deeper within the room. I took one slow step forward, then another, my feet barely making a sound against the old floorboards. The light from my flashlight flickered slightly as I crossed the threshold. The room felt unnaturally cold and empty, completely empty. The bed, which I'd seen only half made the last time I was in here, was now completely untouched. No Evan, no sign of life. But then I saw it. It was at the far side of the room, next to the wall where I'd noticed the strange symbol earlier. There was a small wooden chair, the kind you'd find in a dining room. But this one was positioned oddly, facing the wall, not the rest of the room. Something was sitting in the chair. I couldn't make it out at first. The light from my flashlight barely reached the back corner, and the shadow it cast was strange. It seemed to shift, almost as though it were alive, like it wasn't quite still. I slowly approached, trying to control my breathing. I had to get closer to see what it was. The moment I stepped closer, I saw it clearly. There, sitting in the chair, was Evan, but not like I remembered him. His skin was pale, almost sickly, stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were open, wide, but unblinking, and the expression on his face was one of pure terror. He was sitting perfectly still, as if frozen in place, but something about the way his body was positioned didn't look right. His legs were too rigid, his arms too stiff. It was as though he was trapped in some kind of paralysis, unable to move but still conscious. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The sight of him, of his twisted body, paralyzed me in place. I knew something was horribly wrong, but I didn't know what it was, and I was terrified to find out. "Evan?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe some kind of reaction, some acknowledgement that he was still alive. But there was nothing. No response. I stepped forward cautiously, my heart racing in my chest. I was close enough now to see the fine details, the way his skin had a translucent quality, almost like it was decaying, and the way his mouth hung slightly open as if frozen in mid-breath. Then something shifted. It wasn't Evan who moved. It was something behind him. I felt it before I saw it, a subtle shift in the air, a heaviness that pressed down on me like a weight. My flashlight flickered again, and I briefly saw a shadow rise from behind Evan's chair. It was too tall, too wide to be a person. It looked like a distortion in the air, something otherworldly. It wasn't just a shadow, though. It was alive. The form twisted and writhed, as though it was struggling to take shape, to form a body. The shadows stretched out of the walls, flowing around the edges of Evan's body like dark tendrils. They seemed to pull at him, like they were feeding on whatever energy was left inside him. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then it spoke. "He's mine." The voice was deep, guttural, and somehow familiar. It wasn't Evan's voice. It wasn't human. I stumbled backward, my body reacting before my brain could process the horror in front of me. My foot hit something on the floor, a box, maybe, and I fell to the ground, breaking the silence with the sound of a loud crash. Everything went still. I scrambled to my feet, my pulse thundering in my ears. The shadows stopped moving as if they were frozen in time. The room was silent again. The only sound was my breathing, rapid and shallow. I took one last glance at Evan, still sitting motionless in the chair. His body, that lifeless, twisted form, seemed to mock me. And in the corner of my vision, the shadow, whatever it was, remained, lurking in the dark. The room had changed. It felt wrong now, like something deep inside the walls was awake, something that had been waiting for me to find it. I turned and ran. The building manager's words echoed in my head as I walked back to the apartment. Not the first. It sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't know what had happened to the last tenant of 2B, but I had a sinking feeling that whatever it wasn't going to end with me either. I couldn't stay. I knew that much. But there was something deeper gnawing at me. A need to understand. To know why Evan had become like he was, why he had stayed in that room, staring at the wall, with that horrible, terrified look on his face. And whatever that shadow was, the thing that had moved and spoken, I had to figure out what it wanted, and what it was doing to the people who lived here. The first thing I did when I got back to the apartment was call my best friend from back home, Jake. I needed someone to talk to, someone who wouldn't think I was crazy. The past few days had left me feeling more and more like I was losing my mind. I explained everything to him as best as I could. The whispering, the shadows, the eerie paralysis in Evan's room. Jake was quiet for a long time, and I could hear the skepticism in his voice when he finally spoke. "Look, I know you're going through a lot, but maybe you're just overthinking things. It's an old building, right? These kinds of places mess with your mind, especially when you're stressed." But I didn't believe that anymore. I had seen what was happening. The apartment, the shadows, the dark thing that had taken Evan. It was real, and I knew I had to do something about it before it consumed me too. Determined, I dug deeper into the building's history. After hours of searching, I found something. An old journal entry from a former tenant. It described a similar experience. Strange whispers, shadows that moved on their own, and a growing presence that fed off fear and isolation. The tenant had even mentioned the feeling of being paralyzed, trapped in the apartment, unable to leave. The entry ended abruptly, as if the person had been interrupted. I shuddered, realizing that the same thing could happen to me. But I also learned something crucial. There was a way to stop it. A ritual, passed down from old texts, designed to close the door to whatever entity had latched onto the building. But it wasn't going to be easy. The ritual required a sacrifice, an exchange of energy, a part of myself. But it was my only choice. I gathered what little courage I had left and headed back to the apartment, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. I had no idea if the ritual would work, but I had to try. I couldn't leave without knowing whether I had truly freed Evan or if the thing still lingered, waiting for its next victim. The apartment felt heavier as I approached 2B. The air was thick, suffocating. The hallway was dark, and the sound of my footsteps echoed unnervingly loud. I had no intention of turning back. Not this time. The door to 2B creaked as I pushed it open. The room was just as I had left it, empty, cold, and unsettling. Evan's chair was still in the same spot, facing the wall, but there was no sign of him. The shadows lingered in the corners, darker than I remembered. I felt a cold draft wash over me, and the whispers returned. This time they were clearer, more urgent. "You can't stop it. You are mine." The voice, deep and threatening, filled the room, sending a chill through my bones. I could feel the presence growing stronger, pressing in from all sides. It was angry. It knew what I was planning. I opened the journal to the ritual. The words were ancient, but I could understand enough to know what I had to do. The sigil had to be drawn on the floor, exactly as described. And then I had to speak the incantation, focusing on the energy inside me, offering a part of myself to seal the entity away. I set the journal down and knelt before the chair, placing my hands on the floor to begin drawing the sigil. As soon as I touched the floor, the shadows seemed to move, swirling around me, as if reacting to my presence. The whispers grew louder, and the air grew colder still. The entity was trying to stop me, to break my concentration, but I pushed on. With each stroke of my hand, I could feel the weight of the room pressing on me, the energy pulling at my very soul. The sigil began to glow faintly, and I knew I was on the right track. But I had to finish it. When the sigil was complete, I stepped back, my breath shallow. The air was thick, almost alive. The entity, the shadow, was no longer hiding in the corners. It was right in front of me, towering, dark, and oppressive. "You cannot stop this," it growled, its voice reverberating through the walls. "I will take you." I didn't respond. I picked up the journal again and began to recite the incantation. The words felt heavy on my tongue, ancient and powerful. As I spoke, I could feel my energy draining. The room seemed to shake, and the shadows writhed and twisted, pulling at me, trying to stop me. "You are mine!" the entity screamed, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The energy inside me surged as I finished the final words. The sigil burned bright, white light exploding from the floor, blinding me. The shadows screeched, twisting violently as they were sucked toward the center of the room, into the sigil. I felt the entity's grip loosen as the light swallowed it whole, its angry cries fading into nothingness. And then, silence. The light from the sigil faded and the room returned to its original state. The shadows were gone. The air felt lighter, as if the weight had been lifted. I was exhausted, drained, but I knew it was over. I stood up, trembling, and looked around the room one last time. Evan's chair was empty. The room felt different. The oppressive presence was gone. The apartment no longer felt like a prison. I left the room and walked out of the building, my heart still racing. As I stepped into the sunlight for the first time in what felt like forever, I took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill my lungs. It was over. The apartment was still there, but the darkness had been sealed away. Whatever had claimed Evan, whatever had fed off the fear and isolation, was gone. I didn't know what would happen to the apartment after that. Maybe it would be sold again. Maybe someone else would move in. But I knew I could never go back. I left the city soon after, moving into a new place. I kept the journal, but I never opened it again. Some things were better left forgotten.